Good evening, everybody. This is Cinnamon Noir, and welcome back to Let's Play Aria of Sorrow. Striking a little pose here, and then we'll be on our way. So, unlike a few of the later Metroidvania games on portable systems, you don't really have a cool pose you can do here. But I was trying that out because it had been a while since I played this game, and I wasn't sure. I am still a little rusty, as we'll come to see in a few episodes. But that's the way it goes. So we're starting this episode just heading out of the study, now that we've found the double jump ability. The double jump also will allow us to reach some of the areas of the study we couldn't get to before, where there's a couple of nice hidden weapons. And here I'm demonstrating what curses do. You know, I did that just to show it. Obviously, I didn't do that accidentally. I did it on purpose. Also, both of those hits. No. But cursing can be very annoying in this game. Because so many of the techniques use up relatively little MP, being totally without it is an unfamiliar experience, at least early on in the game. Later, when you have more powerful spells that'll use up your MP faster, cursing doesn't seem quite so bad, but early on in the game it can be quite annoying. However, one good thing about it is that as long as you have your regular attack, you can still do, a fair amount of damage. So it's better than, say, poison in this game, and cursing from other games, which actually lowers your ability to do damage. Which that can be a death sentence, depending on how hard the enemies you're fighting are. Poison in this game is particularly nasty, and there's actually not a lot of anti-venoms that you find lying around. So I'm much more worried about poison than curses. So we've just run into the broadsword, one of my favorite early game weapons. Or I should say, no. I'm thinking of something else. This is a decent weapon, however it does have that swinging arc that I don't like. However, this early on, and especially against these bone pillars, it's a very nice thing to have. These evil butchers are rather curious enemies. Some of them have green skin, and then later on we'll run into ones that have purple skin. But their soul is pretty useful. It lets you throw the knives just like they do. And the knives do a fair amount of damage. Kind of sad I haven't gotten their soul yet. I'm still using the ghost soul, but oh well, that's the way it goes. I've never particularly understood the point of that little alcove in that room. It's really big, but it only holds one item, and it seems like it should be more interesting than it actually is, based on how big the alcove is. That was me just pausing for a moment, probably to see if I actually needed to go back here. But yes, there is a double jump place here that I was not able to get to before. And here we have a hammer. There are a few weapons in the game like this that are blunt, but that have a similar arc to the swinging swords. The hammer can be useful in certain circumstances. Enemies in this game tend to have more elemental resistances and weaknesses than they do strictly like hammer versus sword kind of weaknesses. So I don't think much about using hammers versus using swords. And I'm not sure if I use the hammer in this playthrough at all. But again, it can be a useful weapon. There's me using the Tiny Devil Soul for the first time. One nice thing about that soul is that, unlike the way the enemy attacks you, when you use the Tiny Devil Soul, you get 3 of those little things, which fan out pretty widely, and so it's a pretty good widespread for a tactical soul. This room's also full of winged skeletons, who can be very annoying. There we go. I have never fully understood how to use the zombie officer soul. It says, if you jump while taking damage, you'll restore health. But, in my experience, there's a fairly big knockback from taking damage. I don't know how you can jump while you're doing it. I don't know. Maybe that's for better minds than mine. Speaking of which, I get absolutely spanked by this rock armor. Rock armors are some of the more powerful enemies in terms of how much damage they can do that you'll find early on, so it's pretty important you find a good way to get past them. The armor enemies in general in this game can be a real roadblock. The bomb armor enemies that we find in the clock tower later are going to be very annoying. Speaking of annoying enemies, ghost dancers, who are enemies I really like. They've got an interesting appearance, and they have a very useful soul, which I almost always want, which is one reason I'm killing them here. But they move around so quickly in this game, and they just knock you all over the place. They can be very annoying. There we go, there's the soul. So the ghost dancer increases your luck, which is a very important thing to me in this game because I am constantly on the lookout for rare drops. So I will almost always leave the Ghost Dancer soul on. If I were a little less confident in my abilities with the game, I would probably more frequently put on souls that raise strength or things like that, but I mostly want luck. So here we're going to do our first warp room, which are a staple of the Metroidvanias, and kind of like Symphony of the Night. The first one that you actually are able to use is pretty far away from the first one in the game, so to speak. But in order to unlock that, you need to use a later warp room. So now we have a warp that's very close to the beginning, which is good. So you can talk to Mina at pretty much any time in the game. She'll heal your health, and she'll also give you some useful advice. Often that comes by way of Arikado, but she is the one actually telling you. Mina has a larger role in this game than she does in the sequel, Dawn of Sorrow. She's Soma's girlfriend in both games, but she's a little more important here. Which is another reason why I like this game a little better than Dawn of Sorrow. Not much, just a little. So I'm going in here and selling a few things I don't need. Which is quite a lot. You pick up, honestly, I don't want to say you pick up a mountain of crap in this game, but there's lots of things that you won't be needing after a while. And so there's lots of things you might as well sell. Because unlike some other games in this series, and just generally, there are a lot of good things to buy in this game, and you'll definitely want enough money to do it. I'm also going to be buying a fair few potions from Hammer, because even though I like to think I'm decent at this game, in this playthrough in particular I had quite a lot of trouble. So, Hammer's offerings will change over the course of the game, basically depending on how hard the enemies you're fighting right now are. He'll offer better armor and weapons as the game goes on. For now, the weapons he's selling aren't that great, but I do buy a katana. Just to fit the theme. This is one of the more Japanese-y Castlevania games out there. You know, Soma's a student who's learning in Japan, his girlfriend is Japanese. There's a lot more Japanese-inspired monsters in this game. It's worth noting, though, despite that this game still has Ayami Kojima, who's famous for her work on Symphony of the Night, doing the character designs, and as a result, they're more Western-inspired and kind of watercolory. One of the interesting things about Castlevania is it's always been a more prominent franchise in the West than in Japan, kind of like Metroid. And so, when Dawn of Sorrow came out and they got rid of Ayami Kojima, one of the things they mentioned is that people didn't like the art style very much, so they changed to a more mainstream anime-inspired kind of style. I think actually a big part of that was trying to get Japanese people to be more interested in these games, which had been so popular in the West, but not as popular as arguably they should have been in the East. So zombie officers, like the zombie soldiers, can drop a combat knife, which I've now just gotten. Knives in this game are pretty useful weapons. They have a terrible range, but on the other hand, quite a few of the swords also have a bad range. And with something that you can attack extremely quickly with, it doesn't really matter that you have to be right next to the enemy, because the enemies can be kind of slow. And so you can fight without really worrying about their attacks. A lot of enemies you can destroy or take to pieces before they come close to hitting you. So here's a weapon with an even faster attack rate, but even less range, the cestus, which is a sort of fist-type weapon. Cestus was an old Roman type of brass knuckles, basically. It's a fun name for the weapon, and I do like the fist-type weapons. They're kind of fun to play around with. I will say, though, for a lot of fights in the game, the cestus and other weapons of its ilk are not the best. They just require you to get too up close and personal with the enemy, and that can cause you to take a lot of damage, especially with bosses. With bosses, I'd say stick with swords in this game. Or even other stuff like spears. I picked up a spear earlier, and I do like spear weapons, but I won't be using it for a while. Oh, also in the entrance area, we picked up a Lucky Charm, which is useful. That Lucky Charm, actually, the shape of it, it's clearly a Japanese omamori, or a protective charm. A mamoru is literally to protect in Japanese. There is a similar charm in Dawn of Sorrow, which is actually much more important. It's one that Mina gave to Soma. But in this game, the Lucky Charm doesn't have any story relevance. It's just something that mildly increases your luck. So naturally, I put it on. I'm going around punching skeletons. Like I said, the intersection of weapon variety and enemy variety in this game means you can do a lot of fun things. Being able to punch a skeleton's head off of its neck is just one of the funny implications of it. However, in terms of progression, now that we have this double jump, there are a lot of new places that we can get to, and most importantly, we can start heading toward the top of the castle, which is what Arikado said we had to do. That, I will say, is one of the weaker aspects of this game's story. Arikado doesn't tell you what's going on, really. He just tells you this is a dangerous place to stay, and if you're here too long, everyone you care about will die, including you. And so, you just have to get to the top. He doesn't really tell you why. Arikado is a pretty mysterious figure, and that's by design. We'll later find out he has reasons for hiding his identity. You may already have guessed his reasons, or you might already know, but, please don't spoil it for people who don't know in the comments. I'm trying to keep spoilers in this game to a minimum, although I'll probably accidentally spoil a few things. This game is a lot of fun, and I've played it a lot, so in trying to talk about it, I'll almost inevitably spoil something. One interesting thing about this game, audio-wise, is that there's a lot more voices in this game. Harmony of Dissonance, there were a lot of electronic grunts, but in this one there's more of an attempt to have synthesized speech. Characters will say things when you start cutscenes with them, and enemies will cry out in pain and do things like that. It's an interesting thing. Obviously, these games don't have fully voiced dialogue. None of the Metroidvanias ever did, except for Symphony of the Night. So with that, we have now met all of the characters in the game. It happens kind of early, but yeah, from here on out, everything is just the characters we've already seen interacting with each other in various ways. I really like Jay. He's one of my favorite characters in the history of Castlevania. And he has amnesia, which, that's a bit trite, but the game deals with it in a pretty good way. It's not too tropey, the way they deal with Jay's amnesia. For one thing, it actually has a reason that would make some sense as a reason for someone to have amnesia. It's traumatic. Ugh. Speaking of traumatic, I just get completely beaten up by that Durga. This is, again, an example of one of the areas where you really do not want to have a fist-type weapon. Instead, much more useful will be the lance that I picked up just outside of this area. This place is called the Dance Hall, and it's one of the more unusual areas in the game. So it's basically a giant ballroom with some kind of crazy music. I've always liked this music, but it's not particularly tuneful. It's not the kind of thing you would listen to for fun. There's actually a couple of areas in Portrait of Ruin, which is 2 games after this, that may have been similarly inspired with the goofy music and the carnival-esque atmosphere because it's a dance hall. There's some really weird enemies in the dance hall part of this game. One of the things I like about Aria of Sorrow is that because the aesthetics are mostly very grounded and it looks like real parts of a castle, when you get to some of the weirder areas, there's a contrast that's very striking. By the way, because these cutscenes, talking with Mina, are not really plot-related, I'll feel free to talk over them. What they're mentioning here is actually a very familiar Japanese myth, which is familiar to a lot of people who've played Okami, because a similar thing happens. There's talk about the sun coming out because the sun goddess left a cave. Susanoo, who's this really awful, demigod in Japanese literature. But in this particular case, this is referring to the story of the sun coming out is related to the eclipse, and the castle, Dracula's castle, was actually sealed inside of an eclipse in 1999, the last time he was defeated. This idea of the sealing away of Dracula's powers, which gradually become unsealed, is very important in both of the Sorrow games. And we'll see some of the implications of that later on in this game's story. So I really like the lance. In general, in a lot of Castlevania games, when spear-type weapons are available, I tend to use them. I'm torn as to whether I prefer the games, just in terms of their combat, when you use the vampire killer, and you just have that option, just a whip, and then there's other things to make combat interesting, or the ones where you can use various types of weapons. I think on balance, I prefer the ability to use multiple types of, weapon strikes. But games that use just the vampire killer often are very creative about how you're able to use it. In both Circle of the Moon and Harmony of Dissonance, you just had the whip. So one interesting thing about Aria of Sorrow was that it was the first time since Symphony of the Night that there were multiple weapon types that you could use. Oh, here I'm using kind of an interesting soul that I got from Nemesis. When you use it, it doesn't stop time or anything, but you become invisible to enemies, so they won't move. Or if they do move, it'll just be in the way they would normally without you being there. So as I was saying earlier, one way in which this game is a lot like Symphony of the Night, but Harmony and Circle were not, is the combat system and the fact that you can use all these different types of weapons. Symphony of the Night, I would say, is more varied and diverse in that sense. For one thing, it has weapon combos that you can use. For instance, using the shield rod with various types of shields. That's way beyond what you're able to do in this game. And in fact, in general, it is kind of an unfortunate thing with Castlevania, that there's some ways in which Symphony of the Night really has never been bettered. Symphony of the Night is almost a perfect Metroidvania. It's the game that really inspired the term in the first place. Since, Metroid existed for quite a while with the structure that it has, before anyone thought to call a game a Metroidvania. Oh, I really want that weapon, but I can't get to it yet because I can't slide. In any case, in some ways, really, Symphony of the Night was a really early peak for this series that it struggled to get back to. One of the things that I really appreciate about Order of Ecclesia, actually, is that it managed to go in a new direction and accomplish, a new type of perfection, I'd say, by mostly abandoning the attempt to just redo Symphony of the Night, but better. One of the things that I think most bothers people about Harmony of Dissonance as a game is just that it's so obviously indebted to Symphony of the Night. It's like it's ripping it off. Aria of Sorrow was good at getting away from that. Dawn of Sorrow and Portrait of Ruin, I think, were a little compromised in that respect, although Portrait of Ruin has some things about it that are really funny and unique. But mostly aesthetic and, tone things. But then Order of Ecclesia was actually the first, in gameplay terms, to have a huge departure from what Metroidvania games had been, which is like a series of footnotes to Symphony of the Night. But getting back to the present game, here we run into our first golem-type enemy. Golems have tons of HP, and that can make them very frustrating to deal with. It's generally really easy to dodge their attacks, but one thing about golems is they're often put in rooms with lots of other enemies, so juggling them along with enemies who can do you a fair amount of damage is painful. And golems also are very tall, which means it's difficult to get past them. Kind of frustrating in a game where often you can just breeze through a room if you don't want to deal with all the enemies in it. That's not an option with golems. Most golems also have very high defense. There's one type later on that really doesn't, but that's an unusual case, which we'll see. Here we get the Killer Doll Soul. I've never actually used that soul, so I don't know what it does. The description just says it mesmerizes the enemy. I assume it paralyzes them or stops them in their tracks somehow. I've never seen the Killer Dolls actually do that to me either, so I really don't know how it works. The Killer Dolls, in my experience, are one of the easier types of enemies to fight in the game. Generally, I destroy them before they're even able to attack me once. So here we have another little detour that just takes you to another 500 gold. Again, money can be useful in this game, but one nice thing about it is if you've played the game before, it's really easy to just skip this part. You don't need to go through it if you don't want to. So this is technically still the dance hall. You'll notice it has the same music. The music hasn't changed, and there was no splash screen showing that we're in a new area. But this is obviously very different aesthetically from the other parts of the dance hall. This area is like a basement. Again, kind of curious, because this is actually fairly high up on the castle. So the idea of having a basement that's like on the 4th or 5th floor of a building is very strange. But this is what it looks like. It's always reminded me of a basement. Maybe it's just supposed to be a dungeon of some kind. It also resembles that. But with the crates all over the place and, like bottles of wine hanging around, it looks like a wine cellar. Perhaps they just did that because it reinforces the fact that you slide. Like, sliding is the thing that you get in this area. And we finally get the Evil Butcher Soul, which I show off a little here, by missing twice. It's possible, I think, that you can't actually attack the dolls until they get up. So it may be that that wasn't just, bad gameplay on my part. But that's also a very distinct possibility. So yeah, also reinforcing the idea that this is like a basement. You have this larder where there's these joints of meat hanging up. Very gross looking. There's nothing appetizing about this. You compare this with an area at the beginning of Portrait of Ruin, where there's a butcher shop that looks more like a proper butcher shop, like the meat. It's a little bit gross, but it looks more like it's meat that's actually supposed to be sold. It's funny, in that game actually, you can just punch the meat with your bare fists like Rocky, and there is a quest that actually requires you to do that in order to get some steak out of it, because you're literally punching beef. By the way, I hope it doesn't seem like I'm talking too much about other Castlevania games here, but this may be the only Castlevania game I ever do a Let's Play of. So, when I think of other Castlevania games while playing this, I will be inclined to just discuss them. So here we come up across the fourth boss, the Big Golem. Possibly my least favorite boss in the game. He is really not a terribly interesting guy. He takes up the whole screen, obviously, impossible to ignore. He slowly walks forward. A lot of the time he's not even attacking. The biggest way you get damaged by this guy is just by bumping into his giant arm and leg. And you can only attack his legs. His arm is totally immune to damage. And he just has 2 attacks here. He can either sweep out his arm trying to hit you, or he can belch rocks at you. Both of them are incredibly easy to dodge, and in fact, this is one of the easier enemies in the game just to beat by attrition. You can just wait on the far end of him, not get close enough that any of his attacks can do anything to you. And especially if you have a projectile-type soul, you really don't have to be in any danger at all from this boss. It's almost like a worse version of the Guardian Armor, which is upsetting, because it's the boss you fight right after the Guardian Armor. I will say in general that while I like this game a lot, this particular part of it, from the study all the way through to the end of the dance hall, is probably the least interesting part of the game to me. Oh, but here's something that I really like that's in this part. Right after you fight the Big Golem, you run into a room that contains this character, the Tsuchinoko. You also get the ability to slide, obviously. The Tsuchinoko is one example of how this game is more Japanese than a lot of other Metroidvanias. It is a Japanese cryptozoological creature that's like a snake with a little fat body. And in fact, in actual depictions of what this thing's supposed to look like, according to the myth, it looks even more like a snake. This thing has kind of a weird face. But the ordinary one is just supposed to have a snake head. So the thing about this Tsuchinoko, and it's kind of odd that I keep running into it, is this thing only has a 20% chance of actually appearing on screen. It has an 80% chance of doing what you see here, which is it just burrows into the ground when you come in, and you don't actually have a chance to fight it. It also has a fair chance of starting to burrow into the ground once it takes some damage, so that you're not able to actually defeat it for a chance to get the soul. The other thing about this enemy is that even when you have a chance to fight and kill it, the chance of obtaining its soul is pretty rare. So this is actually one of the hardest souls to get in the game. The soul is actually called... Well, I should say, the soul is called Tsuchinoko, like with all enemies. But the ability is called VIP, and it lowers the prices of goods at Hammer's shop. So it really is an almost totally useless soul that you'd only get for bragging rights. But I was just playing around there a little bit, trying to get it. I have grinded in the past in order to get that. Not entirely proud of that, but... there's kind of a Pokemon quality with this game, where you have all these souls and you want to collect every single one. Which I think is part of the lasting appeal of this game. That there is so much to it, and you can play the game for 100 hours and still feel like there's secrets to it that you haven't figured out. I'm continuously finding out fun, interesting things that happen in this game from various enemies and souls interacting. And, I've probably completed this game 5 or 6 times before this. But you can just keep learning about it. It's a very detailed and rich game. So here I'm switching back to the combat knife. Again, fairly useful weapon, especially against golems, since they won't attack very much, and so you can just keep getting hits in. For a while, until I can get that weapon I saw earlier that we needed to slide to get, which is one of my favorite early game weapons. So here we're just heading out of the basement. One frustrating thing about this part of the game, and this is true of both the study and the dance hall, is that after defeating the boss, you really are just traveling across a place you've already been to before, with just a few things to find. At least in the study, you get the double jump, and so not only is it more fun and fast to go through the rooms, but also you can go into other rooms you haven't been before. With the dance hall, you're just sliding into parts of the rooms you've already seen. So you're not actually going to new places, you're just getting a few items. Not terribly interesting ones either, it's mostly potions. Here I get a little lost in this room. I've never totally understood what the idea of this room is. It's built like a Donkey Kong level. Like, there's nothing realistic about this room, which is kind of strange, because like I said, Aria of Sorrow is a little bit more realistic when it comes to how the rooms are arranged than a lot of the other Castlevania games. I understand why there'd be this big open dance room, but why on earth would there be this structure in the middle of it with all of these barriers you can't get through? In any case, we now have a great weapon, the Cut-All, which is like a knife with other little knives coming out of it, kind of like a Swiss Army knife. And one of the nice things about this weapon is that even though it has a fairly low attack, it hits enemies twice for every time that you hit him. Which means actually it can carve enemies up real quick. The range is pretty bad, but it is slightly better than a fist-type weapon. I also like in general with knives that Soma, rather than leaving them out, just takes them out of his coat, sticks the enemy, and then puts it back in his coat. Very suave. Soma, I will say, is one of the cooler looking and acting of the Castlevania protagonists. A lot of the early ones, the Belmont clan, they're just like barbarians flinging whips around. But Soma has a lot of style, and that makes him cool. So here we are in the upper section of the dance hall. One of the less aesthetically interesting parts of the game, but it does have some cool paintings like this. I think, actually, now that I come to think of it, this might be a representation of what you see in the Game Over screen. That painting in the background there. Here we have the samurai armor. Very nice armor for this early on in the game. It increases several attributes and is almost definitely better than what you're wearing. So I definitely put that on. Defense is a little underemphasized in this game because there's very few enemies that can just carve you up and do tons of damage at once. But it can be useful. Another big problem, I would say, with this part of the game is the repetition in enemy stuff. So in the study, we introduced things like the zombie officer, who now is still here basically 3 areas later. The killer dolls were introduced, in the main castle area. And there's relatively few enemies that are new for the dance hall. The ghost dancers were introduced in the chapel. The Catablipos was introduced in the study. The waiter skeletons up here are kind of interesting. They pull off their heads and throw them at you. You can also get curry by defeating them, which is kind of funny. But yeah, just not as interesting an area as the first couple, but then especially the areas you get to later in the game. Aria of Sorrow is definitely, I would say, a game that gets better the more you play it, the farther you go into it, with only a few exceptions. I do like the trees in the background of this area. Helps to emphasize how high up you are. Here we see what the Catablipos can do. He can turn you to stone. One thing about being petrified in this game, and I think in most of the Castlevania games, is it's not just an annoyance, it's also actually pretty dangerous. When you get petrified, any enemy attack that knocks you out of it will do double damage. Later on in the game, we'll see some places where that can really come back to bite you. One thing we've definitely seen here is that the Cut-All is really good against the Quetzalcoatl enemies. You only really need to hit them once. And since these enemies bound all over the room anyway, it's not like having a weapon with range protects you from them. You need to get up and close and personal with them anyway. Especially since their only real area that's vulnerable is their head, but any part of their body can damage you. Now the Cut-All, on the other hand, is not very good against the Minotaurs, but I use it anyway because when I have a weapon I like, I use it against everything. If all you have is a hammer, Anyway, that's it for today, guys, and I will see you next time.